Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. So glad that you're all here and um, here to just learn about this really important topic. Um, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'll go over some housekeeping and introduce our presenter for today. But before doing that, I just want to acknowledge that I know this day is might be really emotional for some people because of the election results. And I just want to share that the National Empowerment Center is here as a resource. And we just want to share our program, Emotional CPR, which is a public health education program that teaches people how to assist others through emotional distress and crisis. That is a resource, and we want to be a resource to anyone who's struggling at this time. So I just want to share that, and please feel free to reach out to us to let us know how we can be a resource at this time. We want to hear from you. But yeah, just want to take a moment to acknowledge that. And I think this topic is really important right now. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in and just go over some housekeeping, but just wanted to acknowledge that. Um, so let me pull up my slides. Can everybody see this? Okay, so the title of our webinar today is Expanding Inclusion to Embrace the Voices of People Without Children. Our presenter is Katie Maynard, and my name is Shira Collings. I am the grant coordinator for the National Empowerment Center. This webinar was developed in part under grant number S062560 from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Closed captioning is available for this webinar. You can click on the CC or more to view closed captioning, and you can also view the entire transcript of the meeting by clicking on Show Transcript. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be posted to our website, which is power2u.org, number 2, letter U. If you do not wish to be seen on the recording, you're welcome to turn off your camera. And at the end of the webinar, there will be a Q&A session. You're invited to ask questions at any time through the chat function, and we will do our best to answer all questions. Katie may answer some throughout the webinar, but we'll also leave time at the end for questions and discussion as well. And if we do not answer your question, you're welcome to email us at info4, that's the number 4, at power2u.org, and we'll do our best to get back to you. And you're also welcome to make comments using the chat function. So feel free to share if you want in the chat just where you're joining us from and maybe what interests you about this topic. And we want this to be a discussion as well. So to introduce our presenter, Katie Maynard is a therapist in Seattle, Washington, and an involuntarily childless person. She has a mental health practice that focuses on the needs of childless and child-free people and is especially passionate about enlarging the understanding of this lived experience. Thank you so much for being here today, Katie, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you for that introduction. I'm so happy to be here today with you, and I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Hmm, there's the button. There we go. Can everybody see that okay? All right. Um, so this topic does feel very relevant. Childless cat ladies have been in the news. I think we've all seen that. And while that's not the focus of everything I'm going to talk about today with politics, it is definitely on my mind. And so it feels very meaningful that people are taking time to think about this, to maybe learn about the communities of people without kids. And I just am really thrilled that you're interested. So our agenda for today, a little bit of the introduction, and then we're going to work on thinking about some terminology, which comes up right away. Every time I talk about this, people say, do you mean childless or child-free? And what's the difference? And what do I say to somebody? And it feels very treacherous, I think, sometimes. We'll look at some research, some polls, and some statistics just to learn more about like the reality of, how many people don't have kids and what is this like. We'll explore some things around choice and disenfranchisement. Um, as a therapist working in both independent practice now and also in community agencies as a social worker, there's been a lot of themes around both choice and disenfranchisement that comes up for many clients. And now that I've moved into this niche of working with people without kids, I just see the overlaps all the time now, even retroactively. So I think those two things we will touch on, and then talk about the needs of the community, and definitely time for Q&A. Like Shira said, I am happy to answer questions along the way. So if you have a burning question, you can write it down for later, or you could pop something in the chat. And if it's something that I don't get to, I'll look to the chat at the end of the presentation and make sure that we include it in the Q&A. So actually, I'll start with my own introduction as well of like, well, why this topic? Like, why is this important for me? And I'm very open on my website and in all of my content that I've created that I don't have kids and I had wanted to. And my story was one that circumstantially I wasn't finding the right partner. There were some paths to parenthood that were cut off for me. And then I met my spouse later in life and experienced infertility and wasn't able to have kids. And so, in the midst of all that, I was looking for mental health support. I was looking for peer support. I was looking for a community and really wanted to see, like, okay, if this doesn't work out, will I be okay? And I did find it out there, and it was amazing to find the small pockets of the childless not by choice community that is out there, and then learned more about the child free by choice community and how I could learn from them, and then learned more about this middle place of the circumstantially, I don't think I'm going to have kids. I guess I didn't have kids community. And so I really felt inspired to bring this to my own practice as a professional, but also to just enlarge people's understandings of the overlap in between mental health, lived experience of people without kids. So I'd love to start my presentations with kind of the question, um, probably no one has ever asked you before, I don't know, who is your favorite person without kids? I think we all know somebody like this, maybe somebody in person, maybe it's somebody even fictional in a book or movie, but we've also probably not thought of somebody through this very specific identity. So thinking about, this person you have in mind, what are their best qualities? How do they make you feel? Maybe what about your relationship with them is special? What have you assumed about their life path? What have maybe they told you about not having kids? What are you curious about that kind of seems like they haven't told you about? I think if you keep that person in mind during this presentation I'm giving you, you could see them as more of a three-dimensional person, but maybe also somebody whose experience you're going to understand a little better once we've finished. So even I think if you are a non-parent right now, or maybe you're unsure if you will be a parent, there's still a need to enlarge our own understanding and awareness. There's so many different ways that a person reaches this life path of not having kids. And I learn from different stories all the time, even though I've read a lot of articles about this at this point and talked to so many people. I really do learn new things every day. So talking about terminology, Words matter, and they are incredibly personal when it comes to many lived experiences, and people without kids is included here. So, so far from research, from popular culture, from people that talk to me, here's my tally of what I've heard. Child-free, childless, childless not by choice, child-free by choice, childless after infertility, thwarted mothers, childless by circumstance, childless step-parent. That's an interesting one. A lot of people really don't understand that you can have a childless identity and also feel like a step-parent, or you are a step-parent rather, and feel the childless identity. Childless by chance, by relationship, someone who's intending to parent, passive deciders, lost parent, voluntarily childless, involuntarily childless, intentionally childless, no-mo, non-mother, no-mo's shortened non-mother, non-father, DINK, double income, no kids. I've also seen SINK, which should be single income, no kids. Nullipara, non-parent, an early articulator that they don't want kids, a postponer, ambivalent, and then unfortunately there's a researcher out there that named us snoozers that didn't have kids in time. So I think we can reflect on terminology that people use for all kinds of other identities and experiences. You probably know somebody who self-names the list of identities in a certain way, or maybe struggles with other perceptions of their identity. So I think it's important for us to recognize that we can hold that somebody chooses a different word for themselves than we would perhaps for ourselves, or what our understanding of not having parents is, or not having kids is. I know that very often when I post on social media or whatnot about not having kids, I will use the word childless because that is my self-descriptor. I don't think it's a bad word. And very often people will say, don't you mean child-free? That's way more empowering. And it's kind of like this gut impulse that I don't often see other lived experiences getting called out as much for. So I think, yeah, that's my main point, that people get to choose what they call themselves. So the terms that we use hold meaning, and because things do come up right away, like I say, the child-free versus childless, like what should I say? I thought maybe we could get some clarity. So we've got child-free, and there's infertility and childlessness, and then this idea of circumstantial non-parenthood. And so most of our attention in society seems to be paid to those who are not parents because of two things. Like they chose it all outright, they're child-free. This could be somebody that says like, okay, nothing in the world could change to make me actually want to be a parent. I just simply don't want to. And then infertility, somebody that faced this is someone who I've physically tried or is trying, and I couldn't conceive. And sometimes infertility is medicalized, which means you receive treatment through the medical system. And sometimes it's not. And it's still infertility. And so these people are often called childless, which means the general term is like, I wanted to have kids and didn't. However, there's like this really large middle place where people kind of like looked at their life circumstances and said, no, no, thank you. I'm not going to have kids, whether they use the word choose or I've elected to. It feels like maybe the best path the best path forward, or, they looked at their circumstances, maybe with a lot of sadness and regret, and said, well, I guess the circumstances are kind of choosing for me. And I wish it was different, or there could be a mixture, of course. And this is a big spectrum of feelings and abilities to choose. So many people who say that they are child-free can point to circumstances for that decision rather than just an amount of desire to parent. And those who are childless often never got a chance to try because of the circumstances. So there could both be under this broad circumstantial umbrella. Even if they're saying childless and child-free, that's okay. I think it's important to know that both types of outlooks can end up okay with their path as well. So sometimes we do assume people are okay when they're not, is the flip side of that. Since our society has such a bias towards the power of choosing things, the power of choosing child freedom can feel, empowering. And the flip side of that is that perhaps there's pity shown towards unchosen childlessness, or it could just be that many people are experiencing sadness, but they kind of present to the world as child free. I know that I do that sometimes. People will say, "Do you have kids?" I say, "No, it wasn't in the cards." And that does not show the days, months, maybe even years of me like really having a hard time with reckoning with this. But it's just how I'm choosing to present um, at that moment. I think, even the word circumstantial can be misunderstood. So I haven't seen many people like writing, I'm circumstantially child free or I'm circumstantially childless as a label for themselves. Um, but it feels like the words child free wanted non-parenthood and childless didn't want non-parenthood. It's a lot of double negatives there, are the most prominent. And so I think the words are important. They give us a way to find community online. They give us, if we're looking for research articles or community-based articles, it kind of helps us hone in on perhaps what the topic is. But it's definitely like this world where there's not a there's not a description for us that's a lack of something, a freedom from something. A pain-free day means a day without pain. A painless day also means a day without pain. It really means that parenthood is this standard, right? And so compared to a parent status, child-free and childless are different. So what else about circumstantial? I think, unfortunately, kind of both camps of the intentionally child-free and non-intentionally childless kind of do argue about this middle place um, of the child-free community will call it fence sitting, and the childless community can call it ambivalence or being undecided. And I think kind of this arguing in the in-group kind of comes from a social bias, like I said, of seeing child-free as powerless and childless as weak. But I'd love to just remove those connotations and have none of these words be bad words. Um, so I'm going to check the chat. I've seen a couple. Where did the chat go? There we are. A couple little things pop up, and I want to see if there's anything I can answer. People just checking in with their identity and where they're from. Thank you. Okay, thanks. Any questions about what I've said? Any kind of things that came up for people right away around the terminology? It can be a place where people are really worried to say the wrong thing. And I just encourage everyone to, if you're talking to somebody without kids and they haven't used like their identifier, just to say like, how do you refer to yourself? Like, if you're about to say, oh, because you're child free, just say like, oh, I caught myself. I don't know if that's a word you use, or, maybe you don't even use a word. I did a survey of people who had engaged with mental health services at one point. 400 people responded, and the survey was about what was it like to not have kids and to, receive mental health therapy. And I asked them for their self-identification, and the vast majority used more than one word. So it's not that we put ourselves in a box. And there are many people that will say, "Oh, I feel childless today," or "Oh, I felt child-free today." It's kind of can be just this sense of where I am in the day with relating to an adjustment to this life path. So, so here are some like larger data points to consider as you're thinking about this community. How many people don't have kids? So in the United States right now, it's about 1 in 5. And this is measured by women at the end of their childbearing years. If you've seen some more recent surveys that have come up, it feels like a lot more than 20% because a lot of people are saying, I'm intending not to have kids. And the official statistic is often taken at the end of reproductive age, 45 to 50 or so. And there's a lot to say about how we sample this. And there's a lot to say about what about men? What about non-binary people? What about people who have, adopt kids later in life or whatever? But for right now, 1 in 5 feels like pretty clear statistic. It's actually a lot higher in other countries, 1 in 4 in some other countries, and it is expected to grow here. So there's a big debate about the numbers of how many are child-free by choice, how many are childless after infertility, how many have this kind of middle place of circumstance and they just didn't end up having kids. Some of the newer studies, like I said, are showing a lot of the younger generation saying, I don't think I'm going to have kids, but they really do include people as young as 15 and then all the way up to middle age. So it's hard to know who's going to stay steady on their track. So there is a large percentage, as I've shown in the pie chart here, that does hold those circumstantial folks. At one point it was said like, oh, it's 10% child-free, it's 10% infertility, and the rest is just circumstance, but that's kind of up in the air too. But it's certainly the largest chunk. Um, when we think about circumstantial folks, I think right away you have to know that a lot of their experiences can be hard to talk about. They can carry stigma, or they can maybe be like misattributed to somebody's fault, or maybe their own self-sabotage. And so until a poll really asks somebody in a confidential way, why didn't you have kids? We don't know, because it just might not come up. So there's such a bias about parent status, and it's often in this binary of child-free and childless. The research here often shows, through social psychology research or sociology, shows people a vignette and says, rate this person, or they show a video and they have this characteristic of like parent, not parent, age, gender, like they do all kind of vignettes. And so what pops up is that child-free people are described as being selfish. They're kind of envied though, like, oh, I wish I had all that time, but it's kind of like a put down, right? It's not an envied like social status necessarily that people say out loud. They're seen as immature, and very often people will hear, you will regret it, which kind of shows like, oh, you haven't really thought this through. Childless people are often pointed as pitiful, sad. I've had a lot of people say like, oh, I don't want to join the sad club of childlessness. And then also immature, which shows you can't win. They're judged with comments that kind of say like, oh, well, you could have found a way, or something like that. Or why didn't you ... Couldn't you just have ... So I think it's important to know that this judgment and bias are influenced by the people in the vignettes and the person who's judging them. It's influenced by a person's age, a person's race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, the region of the world that people are living in, disability, career, and so much more. Like there's a lot of people who are seen as like, it's okay that you didn't have kids because, or, oof, that must be really hard for you because, or you should have tried harder because of this other identity that they have. So you've probably heard the term bingo before. And in the child-free community, this was kind of developed to describe the implicit kind of like communication that people give, the little jabs, the really harsh commentaries that people will say that can be like disguised as well-intentioned or are just really invalidating comments, like I said here, that speak volumes. So they are not outwardly hostile all the time, but they do carry a lot of bias. And so many people grow up kind of learning to accommodate and respond to this kind of statement, often while like seething inside, and other times just like hearing this statement and not realizing like why they feel so uncomfortable. But if you looked at um, at how you feel afterwards, you realize that, oh wait, they were actually making me feel really bad because I don't have kids. So here are some comments that a lot of people hear. You never know real love until you become a parent. Oh, must be nice to get to sleep in. And who will take care of you when you're older? Parenthood is the most important job. Somebody saying like, oh, I would have gone through anything to have mine. Someone saying, oh, but you'd make such a good parent. That kids are the most important thing in life. And why didn't you just adopt? Or why don't you just adopt? So I have actually heard every single one of these things, except for the one about getting older and who will take care of me. But I'm pretty sure that I will come to hear that as well. So these bingos really display this social privilege that parent status can hold. And so what is parent status privilege? So these are the things that you kind of, if you're a parent, perhaps you've taken for granted, and have experienced just by having kids. And if you look at it from the flip side, you can see, oh, yes, I don't have that privilege. I really don't experience that. So one example is that society has a word for me that does not describe a lack of something. In other words, I am the standard. Like I said in the beginning, there's no word for a person who doesn't have kids that is not without something, a lack of something. As I grow older, the positive terms for an elderly person will match my parenting status. Is there anything, especially maybe for women, that is positive to say about getting older? When people ask me about my parenthood status, they're often smiling when they hear my answer. Oh, do you have kids? Is such a common way to start any conversation. And I've watched people's faces drain when I say no, and often no with a silence, and they don't really know what to say. A religious figure has never called my parenthood status selfish. If I experienced infertility, the fight or warrior metaphor feels really empowering given the end result. Here's some more. When I'm watching a show or a movie about a childless person, their story evolves to reflect my own parenting status. My culture values my parenthood status in obvious ways. My workplace has policies that refer to my parent status. I have used the phrase as a parent in a professional context and been taken seriously. There are many books that I can read about coping with my mental health that focus on my parent status. And I will add websites, blogs, podcasts, right? There's a lot of media out there for parents. People are commenting, yes, thank you. Yeah, there is an interesting piece. Mike has commented about the gender breakdown of the bingos or the parent status comments and things like that. And it is something I've noticed too. It's an interesting thing. Maybe we can come back to in the discussion. So let's talk about the word choice. There is a researcher in Australia named McKay, and I really appreciate her breakdown of, this, how, do we say child-free? Do we say childless? What do we say? So she talks about having active choice, constrained choice, and denied choice. And so active choice means that the person was empowered to make this decision to parent based on their personal desires from the outset, and not just kind of coming to it later in life. It is often something people just know inherently, and usually earlier in life than deemed socially appropriate. Like there's really nothing that could make me want to be a parent. I just don't want to do that. And society says like, oh, just wait till you hit your 30s, you'll get baby fever or whatever. And very often people really do know in their 20s that this is not something that I want. So then in the middle is constrained choice. So in terms of constraints, we're focusing perhaps on the realities of the past or present or a perceived future. And the circumstances prevent like full freedom of choice in this way. Denied would include infertility or medical conditions that prevent conception, or perhaps not being able to find a partner or donor for conception. So in her study, 31% of people were active choice, so totally child-free from the beginning. 15% had opted not to have kids because of circumstances, and some called this voluntary, and other people said, oh, this was involuntary, but they had circumstances. And then 48% were denied and pointed to both infertility and singlehood. And it's interesting because I think a lot of people would say, well, isn't singlehood a circumstance? And that would go in the middle. See, it gets really muddy with research and what we're going to describe, how we're going to describe it. But I think if you let people describe their own experience and put themselves in categories is kind of the best research to do. So the predominant reason for childlessness or child freedom, I should say, in active choice with the women was that they were not experiencing a strong maternal instinct. The denied choice mainly cited infertility. And then the constrained choice, like I said, had a mix of kind of voluntary or involuntary explanations. So I'd like to point out that despite kind of the limitations on choice, both constrained and denied choice women did speak really positively about their lives. And overall, the study findings kind of challenge the assumptions that women who are choosing childlessness to only pursue personal goals. But it's really good to know that there's just this wide experience of how people come to not have kids. It's also from 2008, and we do need to consider there's another generation of people coming into their childbearing years, but I just really like how she's framed the elements of choice. And so I want to focus a little bit more on the circumstantial piece. It is quite likely that you have met or are going to meet somebody one day that says, oh, I would have had kids if. And I'm not really sure that we do a fantastic job of what to say next, right? So people can feel okay about this turn of events, like I said, or they can be in really deep sadness and it can totally fluctuate. Many of the times, the reasons, like I said, that they are about to refer to are really stigmatized or they've been invalidated in the past. So this could be a discussion that would need a lot of understanding and openness and emotional safety to pursue. So here are some reasons and some kind of like categories for circumstantial non-parenthood. There is environmental and social. This could be things like people looking at the climate crisis, there's population growth, there's lack of social supports, there's pretty clear sexism in parenting duties. There's a lot of books and media out there about this right now. This is heightening an awareness, I think. There's social bias and hate out there. There's crime, mismatch, perhaps between a career that somebody loves and parenting. There could be lack of accurate information in society about fertility. This is true, this still exists. Um, then there could be kind of like familial or personal circumstances, and these could be inheritable diseases that people carry, mental health, family of origin experiences, substance abuse, disordered eating, finances, disability, interpersonal violence, having a chronic illness, a lack of family support, definitely some trauma here too, and maybe some doubts about an ability to parent because of what people have been through personally. Then there could be chance, which could be can't find a suitable partner. Maybe you're with a partner, but they change their mind. This actually happens an awful lot. There could be an economy fluctuation, and it just doesn't really quite match up with your ability to financially afford to have kids. It could also be the age that you've met your partner and you've aged out of fertile window just by chance. So there could also be life events. Trauma can go here, a death of a loved one or partner, incarceration, divorce, a war, unexpected illness, losing a job, or losing insurance. And sometimes you can look at all four of these and be like, yeah, all have had an impact on me. And I see somebody in the chat is like, I have gone through it. Like, yes, this I've gone through all of these and they do impact us. I think because of these circumstances, not having kids can feel like really bound up in personal responsibility and regret, and people might not really identify it as a loss because they've never had it or never tried, right? So this is like this weird status of ambiguous loss, a loss of a status that they weren't able to attain. It can also be this sense of a loss that is spread over so many years instead of just one incident to mourn. Often there are kind of these big like guideposts along a journey, like, oh yeah, this was the turning point, but sometimes it's not. It's just a lot of people say, what is it, death by 1,000 paper cuts? Like it can be like a lot of things that build up. So the idea of a loss being invalidated and misunderstood is called disenfranchised grief and loss. And so within non-parenthood, circumstantial barriers I just listed and ambivalence are really disenfranchised by society. I think often people like feel, shouldn't I just know? Shouldn't I just know if I want kids? Or shouldn't I just know how to overcome any of these circumstances? I get that in therapy all the time. A lot of people approach me to work out like, I don't just know, and I feel like there's something wrong with me. So if we don't take a look at our own kind of bias and stigma that we hold about how people should be able to overcome circumstances in general, I feel like we're not going to be fully open to a person who we're trying to be in relationship with that's kind of grieving and trying to adapt to these circumstances. I think another thing to know is you look at this list and it really covers a lot of other things that people struggle with in so many other ways and a lot of other layers. But it's kind of like the parent status piece of this is very rarely discussed openly. Um, I'm going to check the chat because I saw some things pop in there too. Yeah, the word barren. You're right. I didn't include that. That I'll put that in for the next presentation I give. Yeah, the historical significance of this term. Um, Maybe we can get into in the discussion, but that is a word that I think a lot of people right now are actually trying to take back. Like there's a social media account called the Baroness, and I think in terms of terminology, there's an awareness of the judgment stigma that come with the terms, and people are really trying to um, align with a more positive sense of their identity, and in some ways take the word back. Um, okay, yeah, that's a bigger question. I'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, so back to the circumstantial piece. I think one of the drivers of us not really seeing parent status as like another layer of identity is this social bias called pronatalism. And so pronatalism, is this like a new word? I think it's a good gut check to do to think like, okay, well, what does this word make me think of? Does it pronatalism? Does it just mean supporting and encouraging parents? And if antinatalism sounds like being against childbearing, does pronatalism just mean like being for birth? Isn't that like a good thing? Shouldn't people get to have kids if they want them? So these are all good questions. I think it's to air out the feelings and our reactivity around this word. So pronatalism is the idea that everybody could and should be a parent, with some very small exceptions. But for the main thing is like, yeah, parenting is really important, that it's a normal developmental path. I didn't learn anything about not having kids in school when I learned about developmental paths in all my psychology classes. Pronatalism is an endorsement of the social standards that a parent status is more cherished and important than a non-parent status. So I had referenced psychology, like it really does frame parenting as a central task in adult development, if not kind of like the central task. There are a lot of people writing these days, like, well, what about how do we describe other paths? But they're really not incorporated into, um, the current awareness or current psychology education right now. So if you think about it, how many self-help books or podcasts are out there about parenthood? It's a ton, right? Just search it in any social media account. It's going to just be millions. And if you search childless, child freedom, or not having kids or deciding not to have kids, it's so much smaller. So parenthood is privileged in really obvious ways and in subtle ways. And it's often reinforced by our own social circles. So when we do talk about pronatalism in these broad strokes, we also need to recognize that it does depend on identity. And for example, this can be a very racialized experience. Several people have published articles really noting that like the fertility, for example, of people of color is often constructed as a social problem, but their difficulty having children is often not. And so one's identity can make a really big difference in somebody is seen as being valued or devalued as a parent, or whether the children, their potential children, are considered like precious or could be seen as a burden in society. So I had mentioned the word disenfranchisement earlier, and so bias and stigma really does lead to this sense of disenfranchisement and really just not being seen or recognized by society in one's lived reality. It's kind of an erasure, sometimes loudly, sometimes publicly invalidated, as the discussions of childless cat ladies, like I said, have been made us all kind of more aware. When we are disenfranchised, it also means that the nuance that is so needed is often ignored or lumped or kind of just one experience or one assumption. All people without kids are like this. No one who doesn't have kids cares about the future. Something ridiculous. Um, when you're disenfranchised, it can also be a dismissal of our community's anger or grief. Um, Almost every social media account that or creator that I know that's shared their story in some way has had a comment that says, what about single parents, or somehow tries to shame them for their post. Like it happens really quickly, which I know is just the nature of, anonymous social media to begin with, but it is especially striking that it happened so quickly with non-parents. Um, in terms of grief, disenfranchised grief is a term that really has some good books and some research around it. Not having kids is not exactly included in that world yet, but I think it will be very soon. And there are certain losses that are so clear and identifiable for some people, like the death of one's family member that has social rituals, it has supports. The idea of disenfranchised grief illustrates that there are social norms that dictate for who, when, and how people should grieve, and that these social norms don't always match the grief felt by those with the loss. So I think it's surprising when some people hear that, oh, someone who's intentionally child-free can also experience some grief and loss around their experience. And then the joy can also be disenfranchised by a person who wanted kids. Like, we don't want to hear about how they're doing okay now. Other ways that people experience disenfranchisement, maybe they're finding a really hard time finding affirming medical or mental health support. This is huge. I don't know many people that say they've found a good provider right away, or within a peer support community even, that their voices are heard very clearly. Oh, and like I said, there's dismissal of the empowering parts too. Even people that did not want this path do find adjustment and contentment along it. And it's really transformative in so many different ways. And once again, the point that I really want to drive home is that overlapping identities can create more of the or less of this disenfranchised experience. Someone has commented that people don't consider a partnership a community or a family, sorry, two individuals. Absolutely. Like, just our definition of what a family is can be so, obscured. So shame, stigma, and regret are some common experiences in one form or another by people without kids. The topic of choice is a tender spot for difficult feelings, especially looking back at somebody's life. I've noted from talking with a lot of people about their ambivalence that it's kind of the norm to feel a little ambivalent about having kids. Some people feel like this word means a lack of care, but it's really like deep concern about both options, both life paths, and that they're showing a lot of thoughtfulness along with anxiety and worry about making this big decision. So delay is really common. There's a lot of regret and misunderstanding from other people that is just encompassed in this phrase of like, well, if you had wanted to parent so badly, why didn't you? And the things that can really heighten this shame, stigma, and regret are the pronatalism, like had just described, discrimination in social circles, religious communities, workplaces, community centers, extended families, healthcare systems, all kinds of places. Intergenerational implications also come up a lot in terms of family norms or cultural background. People are often, coming to a place of realization that they won't have kids or have chosen it outright and are thinking like, how can I deprive, my mother of grandmotherhood, or, something like that I hear a lot. Or, well, I have to depend on my cousin's kids when I'm old, like, what will this actually look like? A lot of people, when they reckon with, okay, not going to have kids, the next thing they think about is, what will it be like to age without children? This is a huge topic right now. Sometimes people are thinking like, how can I leave a legacy, like my other family members do with kids? What do I say when I know I've disappointed people? How do I have these conversations? So these are all like really heavy thoughts that people without kids can be hesitant to express, but just kind of like hang out there in the background. As soon as you get a little group of us together, they come out, but it can be something that maybe isn't coming out in larger groups. So whenever I talk about regret, I really do like to point out that research has shown that enacting self-compassion and kind of expanding our worldview through that can really help with these feelings of regret. And that there's actually a clinical measure of self-compassion through Kristen Neff's work. And it has these four main themes, which I think are great. It can be used for so many other things too, besides this. I'm being understanding towards myself. So this kind of means like, do you seek to understand yourself, your past self, as well as your current self? Can you focus on both comfortable and uncomfortable feelings? When you do have glimmers of acceptance and understanding about your own story, How does that feel? Do you appreciate the glimmers, or are you trying to kind of push them down? I am treating myself with caring and kindness is another aspect. So you've probably heard it said like a really good way to connect with caring language is to imagine, well, what would you say to a tender caregiver? Or what would a tender caregiver say to you rather? And imagine saying that to yourself. Or this could be somebody, fictional or real. And are you talking to yourself in that exact same way with caring and kindness? Um, I am trying to take a balanced view of things. So this is like, can you look at the systemic, the physical, the mental, the structural, the social elements that have all come together and influenced your life story? How can you learn and explore and kind of understand this bigger picture? Maybe what stigmas and bias have you encountered along the journey? And have you just internalized them? Have they been absorbed? And did they detract from the kind of compassion and kindness you can show yourself? And this last one of, I see my difficulties as of being part of being human, right? That your difficulties are not uncommon, even though they are not always mentioned or not always mentioned by others with compassion. And if mistakes were made along your way, can you recognize that this is a normal part of life? Um, so I think I'd like to summarize, or not summarize, but kind of just end this discussion of all the things that come up that are really hard, all the things that I've seen in therapy, all the things that people kind of like struggle with the idea that there are also these transformative themes about not having kids. In many ways, it is a life path that people didn't anticipate, or if they did, it's one that's bumpy. And there's a lot of work that people do on themselves. There's a lot of change. There's a lot of kind of like personal growth that does happen, and not to give it the silver lining, because that's not at all where I come from with this. But there are these themes of transformation that are absolutely amazing to witness with people without kids. So once people feel like their story has been held and embraced and they feel safe and attuned, I feel like these can kind of emerge within, their lives, and you can hear about them within your relationships. So I think that these four aspects can also guide our own actions as allies to each other, and perhaps from other spots on the various spectrum of non-parenthood, right? Child-free and childless coming together or understanding each other. So the first one is deconstruction, which is kind of like, okay, well, why do I believe all these things about not having kids? Where did that come from? What social norms have contributed to how I'm feeling right now or how other people are treating me? A lot of critical thinking can happen here. And I think it can be really interesting to reflect to people too within a discussion. It's a step in the right direction, even just to connect the bingos, like some of the bingos I had mentioned earlier about not having kids, like you'll never know true love, to the social norms that you want to deconstruct, which is perhaps only parents can really know unconditional love. Where did we come up with that? And is that something that we want to perpetuate? And what does it mean to deconstruct that? And what is true about that? What is not true about that? Owning one's own story is kind of the next theme that I see a lot. So this is a lot, and it can be a really long process. And it's identifying and understanding one's life story with an identity, maybe that doesn't have to be solid or static, that's fine, but it is different than the original plan. This is often seen kind of as like plan B, like, oh, I'm going to pivot to this plan B of my life. It's unexpected, like I said, but often people may make their own meaning out of the experience. Some find joy in nurturing in other ways. Others say, I'm not born to be a nurturer, and they live life and enjoy life in other ways too. Others can pursue a life dream that would perhaps have been impossible if they had had children. I find this a lot. There's a lot of pressure, though, to do so. Like, there's a lot of pressure of how do I make my life meaningful? How do I nurture things? And how do I um, make sure that I'm still a valued member of society? And it's so much pressure. I often tell people you can have a quiet life and be quite happy, and that's fine too. That can be your story. So included here within the story could really starting to understand your own reactions as grief or loss. A lot of people say, oh, I didn't realize this was like a grief thing. Like I am going through grief. Oh my gosh. It can be shocking when people realize what it is. They can align it with other griefs or other losses that they felt. Um, yeah. So the metaphors within a story don't have to be powerful. They just have to kind of be real. Finding community is the next um, aspect, and hearing from others and being in community is incredibly healing in general, right? And so I think it also leads directly from owning your own story and telling your own story to receptive and welcoming ears. It's hard to do that without finding community first. And so when I was thinking like, oh, I don't think I'm going to have kids, who's out there to support me? What will this be okay? One way that I found community was I found a couple podcasts about people without kids talking about their lives. And I kind of like peeked in there, even though I was really sad. It was really helpful to see people talking about continuing with life in a positive way. So as we were thinking about finding community, even if we're in a place of allyship, maybe we can think about how could we make space for the lived experiences of non-parents in our social supports or community organizations that we're interacting with. Empowered adaptation is this last one. Acceptance is a word that's used very often. Like, I don't know how to accept this. I don't know, and some people are not saying I don't accept things, but I do agree with them. Okay, this is happening in my life. I'm going to adapt to what's happening. This is pursuing kind of like your own healing and how you're going to walk this life that either you didn't want or isn't acceptable by society is quite a large ask. And this comes in time too, and it's definitely individual. I think when people are talking about not having kids and you can see that they're fraught, they're having a hard time reckoning with it. Often it's hard not to push for this sense of empowerment. It's hard not to kind of like push for like, oh, but now you can, do this. I think that's just a social urge that we have often to help people move past something that's really hard. Um, but if we kind of can sit and see people within the thickness of their pain, then we will know that this adaptation does come later and we will be with them through the journey. So a question here for us as allies or people listening to stories is perhaps like, how can we support this process of adaptation and seeing where people are and really being present with them in the moment? I see some other Q&A stuff coming on. Okay, so here are just kind of some closing takeaways and some things to remember that you're likely already really familiar with many of the life circumstances that result in non-parenthood, but hopefully you're going to see non-parenthood as its own topic as maybe a new thing though. And this presentation is hopefully cast some more light on that. If you're interested in learning more, there's a lot of content freely available from the communities of childless, child-free people out there. Instagram seems to be the place where people gather the most. There are some Facebook groups. There's some stuff on Threads these days, YouTubes and podcasts and books. So if you're interested in that, there are a lot of people that you can learn from. There is a World Childless Week held every year in September for the past few years. All of their stuff is freely online. It is a bunch of freely accessed webinars and community submissions with different topics over the 7 days. It's fantastic. It's archived. You can go check it out. And then, so that is specifically for people who had wanted to be parents and aren't. And then the child-free convention has occurred a couple years in a row now, and that is also webinars and kind of like community stuff, and that's all on, I believe, YouTube. That's available for you to kind of learn from as well. So I guess in closing, it's just a topic that can bring up a lot of our own feelings about our own parent status. There could have been something that came up for you when I was talking about parent status privilege, where you're like, oh, but what about this? Like I think that kind of like implicit response to that, what about me? What about that? Can really translate into the little jabs or big jabs or negative comments that I've heard or read from a lot of people. It's that kind of panicky stuff that comes up from us. I think there's also such a push with pronatalism that we feel like we have to make sure someone can have kids if they want it. Like we're really worried about somebody not having children because we don't know that they can be happy. I'm trying to dispel that myth. And so I think it's normal that even those of us without kids might kind of feel these our own feelings that come up about different paths to this place. It's all just certainly normal. So here's just a little slide about my contact information to stay in touch. I'd love to do that. I have some discussion prompts for the Q&A, but if people have questions, we can just jump right into that. I'm going to look at the chat to see if we can cover anything in the Q&A. Does that sound good? Shara, how do your Q&As usually go? Is it people unmuting or people chatting?
Oh, I just realized I was muted.
Yes.
Yeah, it's usually kind of a combination of both.
Okay.
People often you're welcome to talk over chat, and if you see things in the chat that you want to respond to, you're welcome to.
Okay.
But also people can ask to unmute, so please feel free to raise your hand or hit ask to unmute, and I can also like hand the mic over to people.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I see somebody commented about Aunt and Uncle Day. There is actually Auntie's Day and Uncle's Day. And I don't know that this is recognized now. There was a book called Savvy Auntie that was published, and people got really into that. I will say that there are some support communities for people who are childless not by choice out there, and there are subgroups within them of people who are aunts, uncles, or all of the terms. And I think finding each other that way is even more powerful than hearing society endorse it. Like it's just really nice to know other people in the same boat. So I'm seeing thank yous. You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Uh, yep. Our languages. There's so much cultural context in our language and the terms that we use. Um, Emily says the generalizations you all are saying are so disrespectful. I'm not quite sure what that means. If you could say more about that in the Q&A, that would be good. The expectation if you're in the LGBTQ community. Um, yeah, there's a lot of bias there about yeah, why people are not having kids, huh? You must not want them, you must not have found a partner, you must not be able to. Mental health issues, absolutely. Yes, the older adults that don't have kids, I feel like there's what's called the friendship apocalypse when people who are your friends have kids and you don't. It's kind of like you have to navigate that. And then you all kind of come back together often, but then it's really hard again when people start to have grandchildren. And aging without children is such a very scary thing to think about until you start to read the research about adjustment and that people in older age without children are often just fine. I think it's just the fear of getting there, and perhaps that there are not as many social supports out there as need to be. But in terms of emotional adjustment, um, people have a lot of assumptions that it's not going to be okay. Yeah. And then getting supports that they want for sure.
I wanted to just point out another great question that I think was
Yeah.
asked in the chat about the parallel between asexuality and
Oh, I
child
can
free
see
by
that.
choice.
Yeah.
Um, and I can just read the comment.
Great.
Do any researchers who study this draw an analogy between active choice to be child-free because of lack of drive for children or parent instinct and asexuality? I see these as parallel experiences, as there is an assumption that being sexual and wanting kids are both natural and inevitable, but they obviously are not because loads of people never want to have sex or babies, and asexual folks experience the same sort of biases you mentioned. But sex is the best kind of intimacy, just wait, you haven't found the right person yet, etc.
Yeah, that is an excellent comment. And I have not seen researchers tie asexuality into the discussion as they should be. Right. And it is, I think it should be though, obviously, and it is this sense of like, oh, well, of course you should know if you want to have kids. Well, of course you're a sexual person. Like it's these of courses are so stigmatizing and not true at all. Um, and yeah, that's huge. Thank you for that. It should be something there. I'm going to do a, Google Scholar search later and see if anyone is talking about it, but I haven't quite seen it yet, unfortunately. Okay. So just if you have any questions or other thoughts, please put them in the chat or ask to unmute. I'm happy to chat about anything. Some discussion prompts that I thought of to kind of get you thinking a little bit was what came up for you about your own parent status during the webinar? Are there some aspects of non-parenthood that you are still really curious about, you want to know more about? Maybe I can help find a resource or we could talk about. Did you have like an aha moment or an insight about somebody that you know without kids? Even if you don't have kids, maybe you thought like, oh, now I really understand my aunt and things like that. Thinking about your own social circles, where does parent status show up? And would a person without children feel comfortable there? How does mental health intersect with parenting decisions? We didn't get into that. I didn't get into that as deeply. I think that's something that we can definitely talk about too. That people often feel and are told more so that their own mental health will preclude parenting and make decisions based on that. And is that true? Is that true for you? Is that true for people you know?
Um, Autumn has raised her hand, so I'm asking you to unmute. Hopefully you're able to, Autumn.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for this awesome presentation. This was really helpful and insightful. Um, I'm kind of curious if you have know of any research into you kind of touched on like the medicalization of infertility, but if you know about any kind of research on the whole kind of like political economy of like fertility treatments. I'm thinking specifically the one that I am most familiar with is like polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is like super common, but I guess one of the like symptoms of it can be um infertility. And my kind of understanding is like PCOS is not something that needs to be quote unquote cured or even treated in a lot of cases, especially since so much of like the treatment unfortunately is like proposed as like weight loss or like fertility treatment. So I'm kind of curious, like, I don't know, do you know if there's any research on that kind of like medicalization of infertility and how that might be also factoring into like ableist and like fat phobic pathologizations of like people's bodies, especially like people who have PCOS. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you for that comment for sure. Yes, there is one of the articles I think I actually put in the slides. Wilson. Yeah. Yep, not trying infertility, childlessness, and ambivalent looked at communities that are not often included in fertility research, i.e., not heterosexual, white, upper income people who don't have pre-existing conditions. And that article talks about their experiences of medicalization or exclusion. And I think that's a good one. There are a lot of things out there that are focused on things like PCOS, and it's kind of like, oh, it's just specifically about like organs and body parts instead of the lived experience of um, that. And there is a book that's like right next to me here. It's called The Seed: Infertility is a Feminist Issue by Alexandra Kimball. And I loved this book. Um, Trigger warning that the author did eventually have kids. And so sometimes people don't want to read that. I'll put it in the chat. She does talk a little bit about bodies and fertility. And I can't think of anything offhand that feels as like in the moment of what needs to be said, Autumn, as your comment. But I would say that people who are doing this work are likely doing a dissertation, and perhaps it's in process or something. So I'm not quite sure what's out there right now. But I will definitely be looking up more about that. Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, Mike had mentioned, you mentioned discussing the gender gaps in regards to my statement earlier. I feel like there is such little attention given to men's experiences of not having kids that this is like a whole presentation in itself. And there is a researcher named Robin Headley in the UK, and he is focused on involuntarily childless people, male identified people. And he has fantastic work out there, is breaking apart all kinds of stereotypes. It turns out that there are more childless cat men than childless cat ladies. And it is extremely common for men to have wished that they had fatherhood. And the research does show that as people age, men have a harder time with it than women. And I think all of these are like not held in the bias of like men can have kids till they're 80, or, it's easy to just, be fertile if you're male, and it's easy to find the right person. It's easy to settle down. All of this kind of social bias about gender pops up. So I think people don't know how to talk to about men not having kids, and they just assume they don't want them, right? Like they're just this child-free bachelor, like doesn't care. And so I think that translate into a lot of kind of the social shaming doesn't always come from men in like interpersonal conversations. Sometimes it's just like excluded entirely. I don't know. So I think the gender gap there, I think I've gotten to your point, Mike. Please let me know if I haven't. Yes. Okay, good. Yeah. So, yeah. Anybody else have any thoughts? Any other wonderings or insights? Any social circles where you all see that parent status actually does come up and is kind of like held by the community or discussed compared to where it's just absent? Okay, somebody says, in my area, when talking with peers with mental health illness experience, we have to work to accommodate those who have children as well as face the shame bias against people who don't have children. Yeah, yeah. I think there's nothing about, like, it's not a zero-sum game, right? Like, if I don't talk about my needs, it doesn't mean that a parent doesn't get to talk about theirs. And I feel like if we are really talking about pronatalism at its core, it's not good for anybody. It pits us against each other. It positions one person as better than the other. If we can kind of break through that bias and really know that, yes, parenting is hard. I'm not going to say it's not. Of course, that's true. And that also doesn't exclude anything that's hard about not having kids, right? Like there's no um, being tired Olympics, right? Like, oh, I'm so tired. Oh, we'll try to have kids and be tired. Like, I don't know where that comes from, except from a place of that person feeling like they're not heard and valued, and they need to kind of push somebody else down to feel better. And so your point is really well taken, that accommodating people and facing kind of the shaming and bias can happen at the same time and should. It says the gay community, there's an interesting divide between those couples who do have children than those don't, as single gay males who do want children. Yes, for sure. There are some social media creators talking a lot about the gay community and not being able to have kids, and the bias seen within the infertility community, huge there as well. And like the assumptions that we make about sexual orientation and like if you want to have kids or not is just another level that I don't know that we've gotten to it as a society, right? So it's just interesting and hard to hear that there is a divide in the community there too. But maybe not unsurprising given the pronatalism seeps into everywhere and even within communities that are already facing so much marginalization.
I just had a question. How do you feel that mental health organizations or mental health providers, peer providers, can be more inclusive to child-free and childless people, like beyond not just avoiding the bingos or microaggressions, but
Mhm.
how can we be like actively inclusive?
Yeah, that's lovely. I think the first thing is kind of like, do we show up in your materials? Do we show up on your physical presence or internet presence in the world? Um, if you go to, you know, any kind of medical clinic, sometimes there's like a ton of stuff about pregnancy and childbearing, but there's not anything about growing old without children, when in fact, like that's something people need to talk to their provider about too. I think in terms of mental health, it is just like absence, which is hard. And so people seeking services, seeking connections feel like they can't bring it up. And so to really make it clear that you can bring it up, it could be a question that's either, on an intake form or on some sort of a get to know you form. It could be in the bios of the people that as everyone's kind of like, oh, I've got two kids and a dog, like to kind of make themselves seem relatable. Like really think about your bios and how you're writing about yourselves. And if you're talking about your parent status, make sure everyone feels free to talk about their parent status in a very clear way, in a respectful way, um, to make it like not a taboo, I think is the word I'm going for. Like something that's like, oh yeah, we can talk about this here as you're thinking about if there's any kind of educational or materials that you're giving people, resource lists, make sure they're written from childless or child-free points of view as well. We don't want to be a community that's just written about. For so much of the research into infertility, if you look to the researchers, they all have kids. Like for a while, I was chasing them all down, like, oh, like, did anybody go through this? And like they're researching it and they actually don't have kids. And a lot of people who were interested in the beginning um, ended up having children themselves, which is, I like their insights and I'm glad that they did their work, but I'm really craving hearing from lived experience. So being cautious about if we're handing out resources to people to make sure that it's coming from a well-researched background. Um, Owning our own internal assumptions and maybe consulting with each other could be another thing that's really important. I think everyone's kind of maybe not everyone, if you've heard of the implicit attitude tests that I think Harvard did, that were the little buttons you push and it really shows how your brain is um, having these implicit attitudes about various groups of marginalization versus the dominant groups. We all have them and it all comes up. And one way to work on that is to maybe have a cohort or a micro community of people that you talk about this topic with. So it's not like you're stumbling over things that you're kind of like, oh, I read this interesting book. Like I read Living the Life Unexpected by Jody Day, a little plug for my favorite book. About not having kids, like, oh, I just looked at this chapter. Oh, let me read that too. Oh, that's interesting. That makes me think of when we supported this person or when we work with this, really having like offline discussions about it, I think can be great. It just helps us build our awareness and our sensitivity and lack of like worry and like embarrassment of talking about it. I think there's so much worry that we're going to get it wrong or that we are going to say something really offensive. So the more like practice with that, the better.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, David has his hand raised, so I'm gonna ask him to unmute.
Hi. Oh, you might hear me twice. I'm on twice. I'm sorry. But I just put a message in the chat that Fountain House, which is a member of Clubhouse International, has a program called the Silver Center to address the needs of people living with mental health conditions. And yeah, I just want to mention that. I just joined the clubhouse here in Bellevue, Washington, just on Monday. So I might actually instigate a program similar to that here.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think that where there's a gap and we're seeing like, oh, something needs to be done, it's just feels so good to see that people are thinking about it and there are resources for groups that maybe are having a harder time finding each other. And seniors can definitely be a spot where you're going to meet a lot of people without kids, and it's not handled very well in geriatrics and geriatric mental health for sure right now. So there needs to be peer awareness and support. The Childless Collective is a great peer support um, out there. It's a website and it's for people without kids permanently who had wanted them. And so that's my very favorite resource to recommend. And it is lovely. It's welcoming. Yeah, can't say enough good things about that. There's some comments in the chat I'm going to look at. The last book that I mentioned, was it The Seed? Or was it, oh, Living the Life Unexpected. Got it. I'll put that in there. Thank you. If you search Jody Day, you will come with a treasure trove of information. She started a blog and a website called Gateway Women, which has changed into the title Childless Collective for the online community, but her website remains Gateway Women. There are a ton of resources on there. There's a section for men. There's a section kind of like for any kind of entrance into this, not totally voluntarily non-parenting world. And so I really encourage you to check any of that out. It's a great book and a great website. Colleen says there's a fair amount of stigma here around people with mental illness having kids, but it seems to get paired with some bias, especially women who don't have children. It feels like a tightrope to walk. Yeah, yeah. So the stigma around people who have mental illness and have children, there's stigma there. And then there's this tightrope around people who don't have kids as well. Is that what you mean? Like it's kind of like you can't win, like either way, you're stigmatized maybe. And yeah, you're right. Like that is real. That is kind of how society is seeing people and judging them. And yeah, I don't have a solution for that, but it is just a reality. And I think letting people know that you see their lived reality and their experience of that and how hard it is can go, um, go a really long way.
Yeah, Mike has his hand up, so I'm gonna ask him to unmute, but just wanted to say before that at our first DEI webinar where we kind of did more of a general overview, we talked about saneism and um that term and how that means discrimination or oppression against
Mhm.
people diagnosed with or perceived to have mental illness. And I think this is just such an intense way that saneism shows up is both like people being considered like not fit to be a parent,
Yeah,
parenthood not being accessible to people because of mental illness. And I know there are like kind of fertility treatments or adoption or things like that that are gate kept from people with certain
yes,
diagnoses. But
yeah,
then yeah, then it's also if you don't have kids, then you're also seen to be this like crazy person or uh,
yeah,
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 unfit for society. So it really is this
it
double.
is. Yeah, a lot of clients come to me kind of thinking, I've got this mental health stuff going on. I don't feel like I should be a parent, but is that true? Is that something I just absorbed? Like how can I know if it's going to be okay? And so much of it is what they've been told, what they've seen, and maybe not how their own heart feels. Like it's a lot of deconstructing and a lot of kind of soul searching that I do with people around yeah, what they've learned about their own mental health status and sanism for sure. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that you do that work. I'm gonna ask Mike to lower his hand, or sorry, to unmute. Hopefully you're okay. Looks like you can speak.
Thanks. So I wanted to go back to, you mentioned about making your workplace a safe space to be able to have those discussions. Is it something that you put into like the sensitivity training or the onboarding handbook, or how would you go about making sure that you have that safe space?
Yeah, I mean, that's like the first obvious step, right? Like you got to have it written down. I think within the childless community, we talk a lot about workplace interventions because a lot of us are embedded in places like, oh, we need to make this different. How can we help? And it is like get a policy written, get something in there is the greatest first step, but it's not the only thing. And so if there are awareness months, perhaps during September when World Childless Week happens, there were a bunch of workplaces where this was highlighted. It was on a bulletin board. There were emails. There could be things that people are totally not aware of that happen all the time. Like if people are passing around, like, oh, I'm going to come in and introduce I've been on maternity leave. I'm going to come back and introduce my baby. And like, it's like this big thing. There can be baby showers. So how to navigate that within your place of work where that is the culture of embracing parenthood and parents can be a big thing. The differential treatment of people without kids, compared to parents in terms of like who gets to leave work when, who gets like approval for time off, who's supported to take leave at the drop of a hat because they have to go pick up a kid. Obviously, I'm not saying we shouldn't support parents in their parenting. What I am wishing society understood is that those of us without children aren't just like skipping around the world without responsibility or things to do. We are often taking care of other people. And so we also may need to leave at the drop of the hat to go drive, somebody to a medical appointment or to take care of our own needs or to take care of any of the circumstances that have freaking prevented us from having kids in the first place. Like it feels like the one-upism that happens a lot in the workplaces is something that I don't know how to write a policy about, but it's definitely a cultural thing that happens for sure. So making the workplace safe can feel like a semi, impossible task to make it extremely safe. But I think that you could go into it with like, okay, we're just going to start some awareness and some discussion and find some allyship where we can.
Just to piggyback off that, I wanted to add, I've heard that one policy that really could be helpful is, and if you want to comment on it or share any feedback, is the idea of like everyone gets to define their family however they define family. Because I do think we have this bias that if someone says like I have a family emergency or I need to take time off to take care of my family, then it's like, oh, of course, like organizations want to be seen as family focused. But if it's like not someone that would, maybe it's part of their chosen family, but wouldn't traditionally be considered family because it's not their child, then that's not seen as important or it's kind of devalued. I think that potentially could be something. I've heard of some like workplaces doing that. I don't know if you've heard of that or have thoughts on that.
I love that. Gold star for that idea of identify your family. Like it just shows if you've ever looked at like a bereavement leave policy, like you have to have like I deeply grieved the loss of an extended family member and I couldn't like it. Well, it's not your grandpa, so you can't leave. Like it made no sense. It was so cold and unfeeling that it just makes so much intuitive sense to let people identify what their family is. That's what does that even mean to them in terms of leave or what they need to do. And maybe it is a single person without extended family and their friend needs like some help with going through their treatment for whatever. Like yes, that is their family. That is a person that they should be able to take time off to support sporadically. And a really attuned workplace would absolutely appreciate that and make it a little more of a formal policy. So there's a lot out there around parental leave and there's so much out there that has grown. Thank goodness people need it. I like that. And other people need it too. Yeah, good point. In the chat, Colleen says this has been a very affirming. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I'm seeing so much positive feedback in the chat.
Yeah.
We just have a few minutes left, so are there any other questions, or I don't know if you want to share any other discussion questions?
I don't know. I don't really have any takeaways except just to kind of keep your eyes open for when people are mentioning this topic in the news, in the in the world, in the social circles you're in, and see who's left out, see what stories aren't told, see if you can add a little to it or investigate like, oh, have you ever thought, you're not really talking about people who couldn't have kids, or you're not really talking about the people who are choosing not to have kids. Like every little bit where we can add to the discussion, I think means the world to the community of people without kids, whether you're part of it or not. It can feel like a big step to take because there's so much pronatalism, but I think often people are open. Like I hear it more often than not when I present this. Some people will have some criticism or some like, oh, I don't know about that. But on the whole, people say, I never thought about it this way. Thank you. Like they kind of have a paradigm shift about the world. So you can do that in little ways in your own lives for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, you're so welcome.
I really appreciate this webinar and just, yeah, feel like it's such an important topic and you do such an amazing job covering it. So yeah, um, so appreciate you and appreciate everyone who came to join us today. And we will be having more DEI webinars and webinars on other topics going forward. So please stay tuned for that. Our next DEI webinar is December 13th, and that's going to be on weight stigma. So if you're on our mailing list, which you all should be, then we will be sending out an email about that. And then we also have another upcoming webinar on Tuesday, the 19th, about the role of yoga in mental health recovery. So I'll be sending out an email about that as well pretty soon. So we hope to see you there. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you have a good rest of your day, or as good as it can be. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.